Welcome to Euros Hartley's Finding the Front, where we get to know the people who front some of Western Australia's leading companies, providing you with real insights into the way they think and approach things, both in business and in life. So get the volume adjusted in your car or your headphones sorted and settle in for a great story. Here's your host, Tim Banfield.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Euros Hartley's Finding the Front. Euros Hartley's is a proudly Western Australian financial services company, specialising in private wealth, corporate finance, institutional sales and targeted research services. We invite you to visit our website at www.euroshartleys.com to learn more about the services we can provide you. Well, we have such an absolutely fantastic guest for this episode. Our guest is Mr. Nathan Blackburne, the Managing Director of long-established property development company Cedar Woods Properties, stock code CWP. Nathan's had a family upbringing steeped in property history, which shaped his life and career, which has now spanned some 30 years. We gained some wonderful insights into his journey in the property industry, culminating in joining Cedar Woods in 2002 and working his way up to be appointed Managing Director in 2017. We then received Nathan's fascinating insights into the current property market, covering both the challenges and the opportunities. This is an absolute ripper. So without further ado, it gives me a huge pleasure to introduce to Euros Hartley's Finding the Front, the Managing Director of Cedar Woods, and all-round great guy, Mr. Nathan Blackburne. Hi Nathan, and welcome to Euros Hartley's Finding the Front. It really is great to have you on the show. We've known each other for a long time, and here we are in the podcast studio about to have a chat about your what is a sensational career and a career that you should be very proud of. So thanks a lot for taking the time out to join us on the show.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Good on you. So Nath, I know a lot about your background and that sort of thing, but for the listener, it's really important to understand the sort of upbringing you've had and the influences you've had, and to generate the career you've done over such a long period of time to be the Managing Director of Cedar Woods. And my understanding is it was pivotal, your upbringing, in terms of growing up in suburban Perth in Gooseberry Hill, up in the hills, and then going to school and that sort of thing. And tell us a little bit about it. Yeah.
So I've got a couple of brothers, one younger, one older. I think the middle child thing is the best place to be.
Yeah.
The oldest brother cops the getting caught out with the cigarettes or having his first drink the first time, and cops it a bit more from the parents, and the younger one tends to
get forgotten about,
lose the fights. But no, we had a great upbringing up in the hills. I had a stay-at-home mum and a father who worked in West Perth, so he had a long commute every day and worked long hours, and including weekends. But it was a great place to grow up in the sense that we had to make our own fun. We were always out in the bush catching animals and making coveys and
3 boys,
that sort of thing. Yeah.
Gee, so there would have been a lot going on. The Blackburne brothers would have been quite competitive.
Yeah, no, look, we all got along to varying degrees, and we had a lot of fun together. We always mucked around together, and remain close to this day.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about growing up with regards to, we know where you ended up, basically in property, but and your brother Paul did as well. And what did your third brother do, by the way?
He did finance for quite a long time, and then he moved into property, worked for the family business, worked for various property companies, and now is a man of leisure, taking it a bit easier.
So the 3 of you, the 3 boys, ended up in property?
Yeah, that's right.
Is that right? Okay.
And at varying times worked for, the father's business, be it throughout school or after university.
So John Blackburne had Blackburne Real Estate?
Blackburne & Co.
Blackburne & Co.
And other names throughout its history, including when he bought partners in.
Right, okay. And tell us a little bit about the business.
So it started out with him and Mum, and he secured some clients in terms of property management scope, looking after single buildings, typically BGC, 3-storey walk-up style unit developments. And he took on the property management scope and grew a client base from there, and then started taking on the sales work that was associated with that. and ended up building one of the biggest rent rolls in Western Australia, if not the biggest, throughout the 70s, 80s and 90s.
Is that right?
And I remember him always saying that, whilst it's a less scintillating part of the industry, property management, it's a recurring income component, whereas the sales is more cyclical.
And transactional.
The property development is more cyclical, but the rent roll side of things is what kept the business going in tougher times.
How did he build that rent roll to be so big?
I think it was really off the back of his reputation.
Yeah.
He brought integrity to everything that he did. He was ambitious and he was good at what he does, but he built a great reputation.
Yes.
And people enjoyed being around him.
When you talk about property and, there's different facets to property, clearly. In this case, we're talking about property management and sales. Did Blackburne Property go into developing at that point as well?
So it was in the late 80s where there was a shift from traditional real estate into project marketing and property development. So my dad had quite an entrepreneurial sort of history, if you like, in trying new things and being ahead of the game. So they moved into project marketing. There's quite a lot of property developers that he worked for in launching their projects in Crawley, in East Perth and so on. But where he really made the shift was in East Perth, particularly with the East Perth Redevelopment Authority and the Subiaco Redevelopment Authority. These major urban renewal projects in a city where he felt he could play a role as developer. And he put syndicates together and made a contribution himself and managed these projects through to completion.
Wow. So this was sort of, I suppose, later in the piece, but in the early stages, your dad's influence in property was a major thing in your family upbringing.
Yeah.
And I mean, it must have had a huge influence on, obviously, the three boys going into property, but it must have had a major influence on the way you were thinking. Is that right? That was just a rite of passage? You thought, that's where I'm going?
Well, I remember spending school holidays in primary school and in high school sort of helping out in property management, helping out in sales, even standing in flats, selling them, handing out brochures for my father when I was 10 or 12. And for me, when it came to that time in year 12, where they asked you to fill out your preferences, first, second and third as to what courses you want to do, it was straightforward for me. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I knew exactly what industry I wanted to play in.
Yes.
And that was property. I was a little more flexible as to what I did within property.
Yeah.
And there was only one property course at the time, as you know well, because that's where we met.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's where my journey started.
Did you like school?
Yeah, I was lucky going to Guildford. It was, it had great sporting fields. My closest friends today are from those years.
Yeah, yeah.
So those guys are like brothers to me in the sense that we've been close for 35, 40 years.
Yes.
I'm very fortunate to have gone there and met those people.
Did you find, Nath, with regards to school, that you were academic? What drove you at school? Was it the sporting side or was it the academic side or the arts or?
So I enjoyed the sporting side and I enjoyed, the academic side.
Yeah.
I was always quite naturally driven to get the best results I could. I was never a star in any particular sport. I was okay at lots of things.
Yeah.
Probably where I did best was the 1,500 metres and the 5,000 metres.
So you're a long distance runner?
Yeah, not fast, but fast enough over a distance. And I remember doing quite well and getting a couple of shields or trophies in years 10 and 11 for the 1,500. But then the school decided to bring in a scholarship kid from Moscow called Yuri. And I never saw another shield or trophy from that point. But yeah, I was
good memories.
Yeah, tennis, running, a bit of hockey, and AFL.
Yeah, and then off to uni. So you managed to get into, well, as you described it, it's the only land property style course available at the time in Western Australia through Curtin. You ended up doing a Bachelor of Business majoring in Valuation and Land Economics, which ended up becoming a Bachelor of Commerce majoring in Property towards the end of our time. What did you take out of it, though, really, from a degree perspective? Did it give you a lot, or did you actually find that the practical experience you were gaining through your dad was more influential?
Much more the latter. I felt the course was a bit light on. The contact hours, the assessment, it was a little bit light on. It was like, you could have squeezed in a full-time job or got the degree over and done with in 2 years instead of 3.
Yeah.
I thought it was overall a good course in the sense that, you had the core sort of business and management style units and then the property specialisation area with a bit of a focus on financial analysis of property.
Yes.
So I thought the property financial side of things was probably the greatest takeaway for me.
Did you start getting involved in sort of more practical side during the degree? Did you? Because I know you went out straight away and you got stuck into it as a property valuer with R&I Bank, which became Bank West. But did you start that in your 3rd year?
Look, I really didn't do property-related work during university. I had a job as the lifeguard at the Kalamunda Water Park. I was a gardener. I used to have a sort of car full of tools and used to go into the gardening at blocks of flats. That's how I earned my income and filled the time.
Yes.
It wasn't until when I finished university, I was actually keen to go, and I'd saved enough money to go overseas, and my parents said, don't go overseas now, get into a job and then you can travel after that. I pushed pretty hard against that. I was pretty keen to get away and go and see the world.
Yeah.
But it ended up being good advice, and that's what I took that advice and stayed on for a couple of years and then ended up going overseas in late 1996.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
You took your education, and I'll just stay on education for a moment, but you did take it a level further. So you got your degree at Curtin and then went on to do the Macquarie Graduate School of Management, Foundations of General Management. You then went and got your Australian Institute of Company Directors course graduation, the Company Directors course. And then you actually went on and did Harvard Business School, Advanced Management Program in Boston. Did you actually do that remotely, or you went to Boston?
In August 2015, I flew into Boston. I was there for 2.5 months. And, it was an extraordinary experience, and I feel privileged to have been given the opportunity to do it.
Yes.
And it was a bit of a game changer in some senses as well.
What an experience, though. I mean, the contacts you would have generated from that particular course alone would be amazing.
Yeah, and that's one thing that they said from the start with that course, that one of the key benefits that you'll get out of this course is the networks and friendships that you develop in the couple of months that you're here.
What were the takeaways, Nathan, in terms of it's a management program, or advanced management program, which clearly you would put principles of that into place in your day-to-day role heading up Cedar Woods. But, were there things that you'd learnt along the way that you sort of felt like you already knew, or was the whole course just really cutting edge?
Oh, look, I thought it was extraordinary in lots of ways. Firstly, it's a little intimidating in the sense that you've got 180 people from around the world that are more often than not running organisations much bigger than the one I was an executive within. And I remember within our living group doing a round the table on how many staff we look after. And within my living group, there was someone who looked after a couple of thousand people, someone that looked after a couple of hundred people, and then a fellow who had several 100,000 in his workforce.
Wow.
So that was a privilege and a little intimidating. But as you get through it, there's a confidence building component to it as well. You realise what you have to offer and your own value add, and that was a takeaway for me. One of the key takeaways for me was really how to bring together strategy, marketing and sales, operations, and people and culture. How to bring those things together to make them hum.
Yes.
And how to find ways to outcompete in each of those strategic priority areas, if you like.
And they're aspects that you would bring into your day-to-day role for sure, every day.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, not a day or week goes past where, I don't live aspects of the things that I learned in that course, including on the people side. So I look at myself as an enabler of others, a fixer of problems. I remove obstacles. And then another part of my role is providing, a deeper purpose and meaning to those within the business. The chief meaning officer, if you like.
Yes.
And so I work very hard in making sure that we are purpose-driven and values-based.
Thanks for sharing that. I mean, that's really insightful and I think really does highlight the value of this educational process that you've been through. If we step back to get to that point, you came out of uni, obviously an expert at gardening around at blocks of flats and what have you. Got enough dough to put together to go travelling, but decided to go and join the R&I Bank as a property valuer. Now, property valuation as a career path, you did it for about a year. And what did it teach you? And I suppose for the listener, explaining what a property valuer actually does in this position.
So I never saw myself doing property valuations long term.
Yes.
It was really a stepping stone to move into some other area, ideally property development. I did have my heart set on property development quite early on in the piece. Firstly, what is property valuation? It's ascribing a value through a couple of different methods that serve as a check for each other to various forms of property, be it a shopping centre, an office building, residential. Most of my work was residential property valuations for banks. So banks obviously do the lending for most customers, for most homeowners, and they're wanting to understand the value of the asset they're lending against. And that's where I came in working for R&I Bank, now Bank West. I really enjoyed that job, mainly from the perspective that you made as much money as you wanted to.
Yes.
You could work as hard as you wanted to. We got paid per valuation. And I remember having a torch in the car for the curbside valuations, because I'd get out there, try and squeeze in, 6, 7, 8 curbside or progress valuations a day. So I was quite keen to do it from very early in the morning to, late in the evening.
Fantastic. What you would have learned with valuation, I'm sure, is the ability to make a decision on what a particular value is based on a set of factors, that whether it's comparable sales on the street or within the suburb. And I'm sure, did you find that a really foundation piece of knowledge and understanding that has helped you during your career?
Absolutely. So if there's two methods of valuation, comparable sales, in other words, what a similar property has sold for previously, and then there's the DCF method, discounted cash flow method. So in acquiring property at Cedar Woods, we are using effectively the residual land value method. So, we're working out all the inputs, mapping out the project over its life, and coming up with a value that we can ascribe to the property that we can make an offer at.
Yes. It's really interesting because that as a profession was a great backstop, but was, as you highlighted, it wasn't really where you wanted to be to start with. So there you've got that foundation. You went on to become a property manager or a manager of the assets with Churchill Knight, which is quite an interesting, I can see where you're going with your career here. You've got property valuation, now you're going into property management. It's very similar to what your dad was doing in terms of that major rent role. However, you were looking at sort of the more commercial and industrial side.
Yeah, I was keen to get some exposure to commercial property.
Yes.
And so I looked after, for Churchill Knight, working under Aldo Gianotti and Ivor Cohen, who were great mentors of mine.
Right.
And I was looking after a portfolio of CBD office assets.
Okay.
And some suburban retail assets. And they were stalwarts of the industries, those two. And I learned a lot on retail and commercial leasing, retail and office property management, and things that I use regularly or have used regularly throughout my career.
It's an interesting though. Did you find that property management, it wasn't the career path you wanted to be involved in?
Look, I had a lot of takeaways from it, but it wasn't quite as dynamic enough for me. And that's really why property development was much more attractive.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of things that I took away from that in an understanding of the way leases were structured, the way properties were managed, what's important to landlords, what's important to tenants. But, I knew there was something more interesting for me.
Yeah, sure. Finally, you got that opportunity to go overseas.
Yeah.
And that was in, say, around 1996, 97, somewhere in that bracket?
Yeah, it was late 1996, and an old mate from Guildford and I decided to head off to Southeast Asia. So we spent about 6 months travelling through Vietnam, Thailand, Nepal, India, which was fantastic. And I could have stayed there longer. But I was keen for a decent shower and was a little bit sick of eating curries and stir fries. So took off from Bombay to London.
Yep.
Had a look around for a few weeks and then was keen to secure employment. Ended up working for Jones Lang LaSalle in Hanover Square in London. As a fund manager, I worked for the Mars Pension Fund, looking after shopping centres, office buildings, and so on.
Wow. What a great job to land on in London.
Yeah.
I mean, an international property firm, and there you are. Just, it's almost like you've got the third pillar of this experience that you got from leaving uni.
Yeah, no, I leveraged the things that I learnt in property management in Perth. And, whilst I knew it wasn't for me long term, there were opportunities of that type in London, and I secured a decent job with a good company.
Nath, for a graduate who's looking at property as a career, we talked about valuation, we talked about asset management. Give us a little bit of an insight from a funds management perspective on that managing for, say, the Mars Pension Fund.
So effectively what you're doing is you're optimising the performance of an asset for a landlord. Or a portfolio of assets. So in the case of the Mars Pension Fund, it was quite a diverse portfolio, geographically and in terms of asset type. And it's how to effectively optimise the income, minimise the vacancies, minimise the costs, noting that optimising revenue might be through a redevelopment.
Yes.
And I did work on some redevelopment projects of office assets and retail assets in London.
Wow. Did you find working internationally a lot different to working in Australia?
I mean, it was England.
Yeah.
So, a lot of connections with back home in a sense. The work ethic was similar, although I'd probably say we work a bit harder in Australia. I found that there was a 4.5-day working week in London. Everyone seemed to head off to the pub at midday on a Friday.
Right.
But yeah, lots of similarities.
Yeah. Well, then you went, I noticed you kept the international theme going and you went to Prague and you worked for Prague Investments, which is in the Czech Republic.
Yeah, that's right. I was keen to go and work in mainland Europe. I was open as to options. Jones Lang LaSalle arranged me a job in the Romanian office for Jones Lang LaSalle. And I took that seriously and nearly took that step. But at the last minute, for a few reasons, changed my mind and decided to go to the Czech Republic. I landed there and went hunting for a job, which was actually pretty hard. It took me a month or so to secure employment.
Right.
But there were quite a few American and English real estate and property development firms looking for expats to help them out, and I ended up finding a good home with Prague Investments.
Did you love Prague?
Oh, it's a fascinating city.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating on so many levels, but the thing that strikes you the most is the extent of medieval and Baroque style buildings that are preserved. You go to Germany, you go to Austria and London and Paris, and so much of those cities were bombed heavily during World War II.
Yes.
And were recreated, whereas Prague miraculously escaped the bombs of World War II. So you've got the original Gothic architecture still standing throughout the city.
Oh, it would have just been so wonderful to be immersed in that culture.
Yeah. And it was quite unfamiliar in a cultural sense, which was interesting. I didn't really know anyone there in Prague, so I had to find my own way in making networks, and I had a lot of fun in the process.
I bet you did. So, Nath, you've really rounded your skill sets at this point, and then the opportunity to come home presents itself, and you do come home. It's a couple of years later, and then you start back into property in WA with your dad. And we did touch on this earlier, and the impact and the influence he had on you back then in your your stages of growing up. But tell us a little bit about why you joined the family business at this point.
Yeah, so I'd had a couple of years away. I was ready to head back to WA. My dad had started shifting the business much more towards property development. And in the time I'd been away, he was doing things that were quite interesting. And he had his eye on some large-scale redevelopment opportunities, particularly in Subiaco, a sought-after inner-city suburb of Perth for those who are outside of Perth. And, he was looking for someone to assist him with putting syndicates together, securing sites to do developments on, particularly medium-density residential projects. And I thought that looked pretty exciting. And Dad and I have always got along well, and I saw it as a great opportunity that he had on offer.
It sort of almost ticked all the boxes for where you wanted to go in your career. Is that right?
Yeah, look, it brought together the various skills and experiences that I'd had historically. I always thought the idea of working with my father was something that I wanted to do, and that opportunity arose, so I grabbed it.
Well, it sounded like it was a real success because you did get involved in that Subiaco development and it came out really well, didn't it? I mean, it's the Subiaco Square.
Yeah.
Which has just been fantastic.
And that was quite a pivotal point for the business, the Blackburne business, in terms of the scale of projects it was getting involved in. So my father had his eye on that land around the planned Subiaco train station for some time. He pulled a syndicate together of Stockland and Rockingham Park run by John Simpson and pulled those parties together. Blackburne were appointed as development manager and sales agent. Stockland were primarily a passive partner, with Blackburne doing really the heavy lifting with pulling the design together, overseeing delivery and overseeing the sales and marketing side of things. And then Rockingham Park, they were there primarily for their retail expertise and owning Advantage supermarkets at the time. And so the three parties came together, bringing different skill sets, and we created the Subiaco Square project, which stands there today as what I'd call a showcase transit-oriented development.
When you look at what you're doing now with Cedar Woods, and I know you've recently completed a Subiaco development, you must pinch yourself when you look back at that experience and now where you are.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Tim, because I think a focus area for Cedar Woods from my time has been transit-oriented developments. Cedar Woods did have some land holdings that led themselves to that sort of outcome when I came aboard, but we also had a bit of a focus area on sites that were adjacent to railway stations. And the foundation of that for me was really the Subiaco Square project.
You see that all over Australia really now occurring. I mean, the congregation of properties close by to railway stations, particularly in Sydney, for example, to develop is becoming, they're sought after.
Well, it makes sense to maximise the patronage on public transport, and the best way to do that is to build up the development within the station precinct. So it enables, better leverage of that heavy investment in infrastructure, and the purchasers like it because they can simply walk to the train station.
Oh, and convenience. I just want to then park that experience because we will come back to it. It's very integral into where you're at now, but I assume that project got to sort of near a completion stage where you thought, right, I want to start branching out again, and off you went to Melbourne. And there was an opportunity there to get involved in developments in Victoria.
Yeah, that's right. I took off to Melbourne. The first time I went there, I fell in love with the city. I was in a sense reluctant to leave the family business because I was comfortable there, but I was also, the adventurous part of me was keen to go and live in another city for a while and forge my own career, if you like.
Yes.
So I was working with A.V. Jennings for some time. Really enjoyed that role. Lots of good people. I had a mandate of building the residential portfolio there and managing the early implementation phases of master plan communities. Very much enjoyed that role, but then was tapped on the shoulder by Cedar Woods.
And that's when it started. This was in 2002.
Yeah, that's right. So I remember getting a call from the then CEO, asking if I was interested in the position of establishing the Victorian office for Cedar Woods. They had a land holding out in the western suburbs of Melbourne, the former RAAF Laverton Airfield. And initially I said no to the role. But then a week or so later, I went out to the site, had a drive around. I knew that they had a mixed-use vision for the site, but predominantly industrial. But I saw a different opportunity, as did the then MD, to turn this industrial project into a major new town and residential community for West Melbourne.
And what's that called, Nath?
That's a project called Williams Landing.
And that's Williams Landing.
Yeah, it's an exceptional development in many respects. Not often do you get the opportunity with a blank canvas to create a town in an infill context and surrounding new government infrastructure in the form of a freeway interchange, a train station, and a regional serving bus port.
Nath, we can come back to that in a way, but the principle behind your appointment in Victoria by Cedar Woods, which was headquartered out of Perth, founded in 1987, was to provide a diversified business strategy for the company. And you were appointed state manager for Victoria, in essence, when you decided to take the job.
Yep.
And that has been an amazing move for the business over what has now been 23 years since you've been there. And that expansion has occurred over that period of time such that you've gone up the East Coast. Tell me a little bit about, from a Perth property business and that expansion, what it did to your diversification, what it did to your earnings, what it did to the business model overall, because you've been an integral part of that. And I just want to sort of talk about that in light of the fact that you spent quite a long time in Melbourne. I mean, 17 years of your life has been in Melbourne. And you've had a really integral part to play in this expansion and rollout.
So residential property is a cyclical business. And being Perth-based and Perth-focused, in order to iron out the lumpiness of earnings, diversification, geographic diversification was needed. And my predecessors saw fit to invest quite audaciously in a large project, the former Laverton Airfield in Melbourne. And that was the first step in that diversification journey. Where I came in was to turn that asset into something that produces profits and revenues. And the company also gave me quite a wide mandate. Once I had established the Victorian operations, they were open for me to pursue opportunities elsewhere on the East Coast. After acquiring a couple of projects and some great staff, a couple of which are still with me today, back in the early 2000s, I had a network of people looking for projects for me in Queensland. I thought that was the best place to allocate some capital to in terms of the population growth and the residential development opportunity that state presented. So we then made quite an audacious large-scale acquisition in Brisbane. It was the last master plan community site within the Brisbane LGA. And then following that, we made a decision to move into South Australia, and I led that with Cedar Woods. And we bought quite a large project. In fact, it's the largest project in Adelaide called Glenside. It's 1,000 apartments that we'll be delivering over a decade.
Well, in that role, so you were sort of state manager, for want of another word, for South Australia, Victoria and Queensland in the end. So this was, if we take it through, you've started in 2002. 2014, you're a state manager for those three states. You then clearly have your foot on a few development sites, and the Perth office says, righto, Nathan, time to step up, and you became Chief Operating Officer, where you had to look after the operations nationally, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So think of it, at that time, we now had operations in 4 states and many more projects. So the number of projects being managed, the scale of the business was much larger than it was 5, 6, 7 years prior. So it warranted a different executive structure, and therefore the role of Chief Operating Officer was created. But the chairman also had in mind a succession plan for the long-standing CEO, Paul Sadlier, who I'm in close contact with today. And so the reason was twofold for creation of that role, and that role still exists today.
Well, it's been a very successful rollout of the business into the East and including Western Australia. I mean, just out of interest, do you remember what they paid for that land back in Williams Landing before, when it was an industrial site?
Yeah, it's a good question, Tim, because they paid $10 million for a 275 hectare infill site in 1997, and that 30-year development was cash flow positive year one. Year one of its revenue production. It took a while to get to that start line, but year one of production, it became cash flow positive. So it's a high margin, high performing project that's got, in fact, about another decade to go. So, and I haven't worked out the number, but we would have already around $1 billion worth of revenue from that project alone.
So it was a good decision.
Yep.
Yeah, fantastic. And then what about Brisbane?
So Brisbane was a logical market for us. We've built quite a presence there now. We've got a portfolio of about 5 projects and 15 staff there. It's an important market to play in from a residential property development perspective because of its relative affordability to Sydney in particular.
Yes.
But also because of the projected population growth.
And that then flows into South Australia. Are you seeing a similar sort of growth pattern there?
Adelaide's a different story.
Right.
So we went to Adelaide because everyone else left. And we just saw an opportunity on a high-quality site to meet the market for medium-density housing in the form of townhouses and in the form of mid-rise apartments. So we bought a big site in Port Adelaide and the site from the state government in Glenside, 3 kilometres from the CBD. And that's been a really important market for us. It punches above its weight in terms of profit contributions.
It's really interesting when we talk about this, multiple geographies and multiple products of which you then can broaden your customer base. Now, I just want to park that because you were then made managing director of Cedar Woods in 2017. So you joined in 2002. Here we are 15 years later, and you're responsible for the company. That must have been an amazing feeling, a sense of reward.
Yeah, look, it's Cedar Woods has a history of internal promotion, and that practice continues today. If you look at the COO now, Patrick Archer, he started out as a development manager working with me in Melbourne, and the same with the CFO, started out as a financial controller. So we have that practice, and it's worked well for the business. And it was great to be afforded that opportunity to come back to Perth and take on that role of overseeing the business. To be honest, I was a little reluctant to come back to Perth because I was enjoying Melbourne and my family was established there. Both of my kids were born there. But, Melbourne was hard to leave, but in a sense, Perth was easy to come to.
Yes.
And I had family here, which I was keen to reconnect with. My parents were getting older and I was keen to spend more time with them. So whilst I deliberated on that decision of whether to return or not, eventually I made that decision. It was the right one.
Well, congratulations for then. I mean, it's a huge achievement, and the rollout that you achieved through those states to be then afforded the role of COO and then to go to managing director, I think also demonstrates to the listener your perseverance and loyalty to Cedar Woods over that period of time. I mean, 15 years is a long time. Did you ever think about other opportunities?
Yeah, look, there's been a couple of forks in the road in terms of my journey. One of them which occurred at a similar time to taking on the Cedar Woods role, where I could have gone off and taken a senior development role with a much larger property outfit. And, I often reflect on how...
The sliding doors.
How different things could have been. But I have no regrets, and I'm very happy with the path that I've taken. Cedar Woods has been good to me, and that's why I've been loyal to it.
Fantastic. We were talking offline, but what's interesting about Cedar Woods is it is a listed property company, right? And it had a share price when you joined, I think of around 67 cents. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's around that mid-60s is certainly what it was in the early 2000s.
So the Cedar Woods team has progressively grown over that time such that it's now got a stock price of $5.65 or thereabouts, okay, in current market terms, with a market cap of about 460 odd million.
Yeah, that's
which
right.
is it's a big growth path.
It's a great story of disciplined execution of strategy and having the right strategy. So you mentioned before that it's a strategy of having a broad customer base, and that's exactly what it's about, because residential property is a cyclical industry, and the best way to iron out those cycles is to have multiple products, multiple price points, and different locations. Because as we're seeing now, different geographic markets perform at different points in the cycle. For example, Victoria is down now, Queensland, South Australia and WA are up. But there's been plenty of times where Victoria has carried the rest of the country. So that enables us to deliver a smoother growing earnings profile for our investors. And we're driven by long-term value creation for our investors through the development of vibrant communities nationally.
Yes.
And we've delivered on that in terms of the total shareholder return that we've delivered for our investors, many of which are sticky, if you like, have been around for a long time and
Yes.
loyal to the company. We've been able to deliver them sector-leading returns.
It's interesting you talk about returns, and I think we've seen an extraordinary period of growth in the property sector. We can talk about different parts of the property sector, but let's say per se residential at the moment. I was just looking at your numbers. Over FY24, you achieved record net sales of 1,201 lots/units, up 73% on the previous financial year. That's a big jump, Nathan. I think when I look at, I'm reading further, FY25 pre-sales of 559 million with about 70% to settle within the year. The balance in FY26, but what I'm pointing to is it's an interesting period of time in the property market. Would you like to just give us a bit of an insight into when you're looking as an MD of a property firm and you're looking to achieve reliability and consistency of earnings? Property is cyclical. We've seen the ups and the downs in valuations over many, many years. Just talk us through that.
Whilst we're not immune to the residential property cycles and the macroeconomic factors that influence the industry that we're in, I think more than many others in our sector, we've been able to smooth out that earnings profile. Yes, from year to year and when extraordinary factors such as COVID hit, earnings dipped. But over time, we've had a great story of building the number of lots under production, building the number of projects that we have on our books.
I read you've got a portfolio of about 40 projects.
Yeah, and that's the highest number the company has had, and we've got a great team of people, many of which have been with the company for a long period of time, working hard to uncover those gems that can generate long and solid returns for our investors. And people often ask me, how is it that every year you manage to keep uncovering these solid earners? But we've managed to do it for 30 years now. So we've got the knack of, building our networks and uncovering projects and converting off-market opportunities into projects for the company.
Nath, without giving away trade secrets, it's a very valid question for people to ask. How do you keep uncovering these development sites so you can continue to do it? You must have a network that is amazing across Australia, has their ear to the ground and is enabling opportunities for Cedar Woods?
Yeah, so we need to consistently buy, not only in order to replenish, but in order to grow earnings.
Yes.
It varies from year to year as to how many projects we buy and how big they are, but we're generally buying 2 or 3 projects a year. We're quite tactical and research-based in where we acquire and what we acquire. We look at the demographic changes, we look at the supply-demand equation in various markets in order to make decisions on capital allocation. We have an overarching objective of having a diversified income stream, so that will help guide where we place our capital. Part of that diversification story is the product types. So if in recent years we might have bought more land subdivisions, we might pivot some of that capital towards apartments or townhouses.
Yes.
So we balance all of those things in working out where to allocate capital. And then how do we uncover these off-market opportunities? Yeah, we've got a network of agents and consultants.
Yeah.
We also reward our consultant network by bringing us off-market opportunities and promising them work on the project going forward. But there's a few other little nuances to the way we uncover things, other than to say that, we've got a great track record of being able to do that year after year.
Well, it's just evident. The track record is there to be seen. When you look at the development sites, let's say, for example, you may look at different states, you look at different geographies within those states and say, well, apartment blocks are more suitable on the East Coast, say, to Western Australia, where single detached dwellings are probably more accepted. Do you look at a rate of return on those that at a set benchmark that you think, right, well, my cost of capital, my return on capital, it's got to equal X?
So built form projects, developing townhouses and apartments, is a riskier proposition than a land subdivision.
Yes.
Some of the banks might have a different view, but with land subdivision, it's easier to stop a project if market conditions turn. So if you've got a horizontal piece of land that you're developing, you develop stage 1, 2, the market turns, you can just stop developing. But with a vertical project, you develop 200 apartments.
Your boots and all.
Once you're 2/3 of the way up, if the market turns, you got to keep going. So we like being involved in both. It makes it a more interesting workplace. Staff love working on a variety of projects. It generates a smoother earnings profile. And we think both house and land packages on the urban fringe, townhouse development in the middle and inner suburbs, and medium-rise apartment projects are a good space for us to play in. We've developed an expertise in that area, and we're keen to keep playing our role in delivering medium-density projects throughout Australian capital cities.
The inner city, if we just come back to Subiaco, for example, you could have sold that a number of times, I understand, in terms of the development there.
So a couple of years ago, we bought off the Subiaco Council the old TAFE site, and we have developed 44 townhouses. We've got lots of happy customers in there, and we're very proud of that project. It looks great. There's a nice integrated contemporary style of architecture. And fortunately for the purchasers, there's been lots of value growth, and we love our customers to have that experience.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And have you had that experience around, in other parts of Australia in terms of the growth?
Yeah, I think if you look at what has happened to property values over the past 20 years, whilst there's been down periods, generally speaking, property values have improved quite dramatically or increased quite dramatically over the past couple of decades. Perth has been flat. It was flat for quite a while, but has really come into its own in the last year or two. And in our own portfolio, for example, we've seen price growth of about 30% across our 10 or so projects here.
So the consumer has been very happy with the product and then the subsequent market movement.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a great segue into what's going on in the property market, and we just talked about the growth that Cedar Woods has experienced. If we were to just focus at the moment on Perth, I mean, it's been a phenomenal growth period, particularly in the last year. What's your view in terms of the future and how that growth rate's looking to unfold?
So Cedar Woods operates in 4 markets, Queensland, South Australia, Victoria, WA.
Yeah.
WA is by far our biggest market in terms of number of projects. Perth had quite an elongated period of subdued conditions, and it was being carried by the rest of the country, particularly Victoria. But it's really come into its own because of its affordability, because WA has the highest median wages in the country, except for ACT. It has the lowest unemployment rate. Those factors combined have generated the positive conditions that we're now experiencing. And it is around a decade since we've seen these sales volumes and this rate of price growth. And I think there's quite a bit more runway to go in this. There is still quite a significant gap between the Perth median house price and the Sydney median house price. It's just over 50% on the last numbers I looked at. And if the unemployment rate is lower and the median wages are higher than Sydney, then that would suggest that there's still a bit to go in Perth median values.
Are we seeing, or is Cedar Woods seeing, a pickup in interstate buyers for the projects?
It has markedly picked up, not only from people moving from interstate, particularly Victoria and New South Wales, securing higher paying jobs in WA, but also East Coast-based investors looking to secure Perth property, which they know they'll quickly rent out and have quite a strong rental yield, the strongest that we've seen in many years.
Are we talking a gross yield of somewhere between 5 and 6% on property at the moment for residential?
More like 4 to 5%.
4 to 5, right, okay.
Yeah.
And that would clearly go up depending on if you went into the regional areas.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you're certainly in some of those towns that are benefiting from the mining sector, those properties are generating much higher yields than that, noting the cyclicality of those markets.
Yes, yes. Nath, if we put into context interstate and overseas buyers in Perth, the nature of the employment market, the limitation on infill that's existing and development sites, can we just get a comment from you or an insight into supply and how that will impact the price of property going forward? And I also want to context that around interest rates and costs of building, right? So we all know it's hard for developers to then, as you've highlighted, to then go out and buy a development site but then build because the build is so costly. Holding costs are high because of the interest rate market. How's that going to affect that property price escalation in the short term, I would say?
The lack of supply is certainly one factor that's giving us the view that there is further price growth to go across our capital cities in terms of residential housing, in terms of housing. So we have quite a supply issue, a chronic supply issue across all product types, across all jurisdictions. And it's an issue that is going to take some time to fix. And the great conundrum is that we have such a low unemployment rate. Business is screaming out for more skilled labour from overseas, but there's nowhere to house them.
Yes.
The rental vacancy rate across our capital cities is sub 1%. And most would consider market equilibrium to be somewhere between 3 and 5% vacancy rate.
Yes.
So we're a long way off that. And then if you look at the commencements of apartment projects across our capital cities, we are well off the highs, for example, in Perth, where we were delivering in excess of 2,000 apartments a year. The last couple of years, we've been delivering in the order of 1,000, so
50% less.
Half those volumes. And with construction costs where they're at and the pool of builders quite low, that's not going to change anytime soon. So that's why we think it's going to take around 5 years in order to meaningfully fix this supply issue. And those developers that have big pipelines of projects, for example, Cedar Woods, we've got the 40 developments and 10,000 lots, dwellings or units. We're in quite a privileged position to deploy into an undersupplied market.
Well, you would probably have a waiting list of buyers.
Certainly in WA, Queensland and South Australia, there's lots of inquiry, very healthy inquiry across our product types. And upon making a release at any particular project, it does tend to sell out quite quickly.
Yes.
But it is a different story in Victoria, and it does work for our business for different jurisdictions to be at different points in the cycle.
Yeah.
And conditions are quite subdued at the moment in that market.
Well, how do you think this cost of building is going to come down over time, though? How do you think that is going to change? You did mention a 5-year term, but how will it come down when you think about the challenges?
If you look at the components of construction cost, you've got labour and materials.
Yes.
It's the labour component that is inflating at a high rate at the moment. Some materials are coming down in cost if you look at steel and timber. Some materials are stable in cost, others are going up. Overall, on the materials side of things is much more stable than the labour side of things. The growth rate for labour is extraordinary, and we just need more people, more skilled labour in this country in order to help with many issues, including the housing task.
And that's not an easy fix. I mean, immigration is one way. But, we are talking about then it's a supply of labour issue versus the cost of the supply of product to get the jobs done.
So there's a couple of factors here in terms of our industry and fixing this supply issue. We've had extraordinary cost growth. In most states, we've recently had extraordinary price growth. And as long as that price growth outpaces the cost growth, projects are viable.
Yes.
And that's why things are working well for most projects in most of our locations. But it then gives rise to affordability issues.
Yes.
Costs are still growing at 3 to 5% a year. If we assume a further 10% price growth on the end product in, say, Queensland and Western Australia for the next 12 months, that's further erosion of affordability. At the moment, this is not slowing the sales rate, but logic will tell you that eventually the buyer pool reduces.
Yes. It's a challenging situation, isn't it? I mean, I must spend a little bit of time at that management level looking at scenario analysis on what's going to unfold going forward.
We're fortunate to have a bit of a focus at the more affordable end.
Yes.
with our products. Whilst we have that broad customer base offering, for example, $1.5 or $2 million townhouses in some markets, the vast majority of our product is affordable detached housing on the urban fringe.
Right.
That is what is outperforming now, and that is what is set to outperform over the next decade because of the issues we've just been talking about.
Oh, thanks a lot, Nath. I mean, we could talk about this for ages because I think a lot of Australians really do take an interest in this because property is almost like a birthright. We all aspire to buy houses, and it must feel good for you to be able to have an influence on the market and give people an alternative.
Yeah, it's a noble profession in that sense. Buying a property is the biggest financial decision that people make in their lives. And I never waste an opportunity to point that out to our staff, be it a salesperson, someone running a marketing campaign, or a development manager overseeing a project. A constant reminder that you're creating the most important asset and the most important financial investment people make in their lives.
Yes, absolutely. Let's just move to the left a little bit and talk about you. Cedar Woods has obviously taken up a lot of your time, but you've got 2 young kids. That they have also taken up a lot of your time. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've got 2 kids, Adela, who's 15 and going to St Hilda's, and then I've got Otto, who's 12. Both are great kids. I'm very proud of them. They're achieving well academically. They're very sporty. My daughter was very fortunate to be selected for the under-19s national floorball team.
Oh, is that right?
It's quite a niche sport, a fringe sport here in Perth, but a really exciting one and an up-and-coming sport. And she went and recently played in the nationals in Helsinki in Finland. And for a 15-year-old to be playing in the under-19s, it was quite an achievement.
Well, congratulations to her. That's amazing. Gosh, I mean, to be able to go to Helsinki too to do it, that's what an experience.
Yeah, a great opportunity for them. But yeah, very proud of both kids and everything we've done to make them who they are.
Yeah.
And, you know, they're a great joy and a big part of my life.
Now we can talk about your brother, who's clearly into apartments and property as well. Do you guys sit around the table and have a good chat about what the value of apartments are doing and across Australia? I mean, Paul's more focused in Perth.
When I talk about this to friends, I often reflect on my late mother and how much she put up with the not only having 4 men in the house, but all of us in property, and how much she endured in terms of conversations around property around the dinner table.
She would have had a good view though, no doubt.
Very patient. Yeah, we're always talking about property, passionate about property. There's plenty of banter and conversation about the industry, where it's going and what we're up to.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's enjoyable in that respect.
When you guys have this conversation, I'm sure that the regulatory side of property comes up, and I'm sure it comes up within your business too, but, you know, the nature of getting approvals through and within design, within plan, environmental approvals, that sort of thing. Is that becoming a longer process?
So NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is a problem around the country. Much of a big portion of the future supply needs to come from inner and middle suburbs.
Right.
And that means densifying areas and looking for urban redevelopment opportunities, old school sites, old industrial areas that are regenerating. Those apartments and townhouses are an important part of that supply equation. But delivering it is very difficult because local councils generally don't want to support it. There's often a vocal minority that are quite effective in hampering the delivery of these projects. And our job as developers, and government's job as well, is vocalising the majority. Because you look at these projects like the ones that we're delivering in Subiaco, the vast majority of people appreciate the vibrancy, the diversification that these different housing forms bring to what is otherwise quite a homogenous area in terms of housing types.
Yes.
So that diversity brings with it, you know, different family structures, more people, which therefore justifies more retail, more cafes. So there's lots of advantages. And as people move through their life stages, the kids move away from home. Couples or families don't often want the large family home that needs all that maintenance and wasted space. They often want to downsize, but they want to do it in the area that they're familiar with.
Yes.
But there's just not enough opportunities in Subiaco, for example. So that's where that product plays an important role going forward. For that downsizer market, for the first home buyer market, retirees and everything in between.
Very interesting. Well, Nath, look, I'm conscious of time. As I said earlier, we could talk forever around all this because I'm fascinated in it. I will note though, one of the things that I did really take a lot of heart out of was that you have a big passion for fly fishing.
Yeah.
And you've adopted it around different parts of the world.
That's one reason I didn't want to move from Victoria because, you know, there's no such thing as freshwater fly fishing here in Perth or not, certainly not to the extent that there is in Victoria. I'd often take off to rivers like the Mitta in the far eastern parts of Victoria to go fishing with a couple of mates. And, you know, it's a great getaway. But it's also a great excuse to get off the beaten track in various places around the world, like, you know, the northern parts of Norway or Sweden. And probably the more interesting trip was Siberia. Around 2007 or 2008, I went to Far East Russia to fly fish and took quite a bit of effort to get there in terms of Seoul in Korea and then Vladivostok and then Irkutsk in the center of Russia and then a tugboat and then a long walk. And it took 3 days to get to this river. And yeah, that was a great experience, being in the middle of nowhere with a friend and a guide and living off the land.
Oh, what a wonderful experience. That's amazing. Did you catch one?
Enough to live on.
I just want to say thank you very much for taking the time out. And we've had a bit of a journey here that's taken us through a pathway that started out working into the family business that's eventuated into a career that's eventuated into 23 years with Cedar Woods and still going strong. Congratulations on what you've been able to achieve. And I think when you look at the pipeline that Cedar Woods has ahead of it and your ambitions and the way you're going about it, it makes for an outstanding story. And I really, on behalf of Euros Hartleys, thank you a lot for sharing with us, and the listeners will get a lot out of this. So thanks a lot for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion, Tim. It's been enjoyable.
Good on you. Thanks, mate.
Cheers.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to Euros Hartleys Finding the Front. This podcast is for general information purposes only. Please check out euroshartleys.com for more information. Euros Hartleys holds Australian Financial Services Licence 230052.